Welcome to another episode of Judge for Yourself. Recently, the university rector at Free State University, Jonathan Jansen, basically gave a very controversial speech about language and education. In his delivering the speech, he suggested that English should be the primary language of instruction, that is, to give children a better chance of success in the overall education system in this country. Although he said that his comments were distorted by the media, it has unquestionably opened up a serious debate about language diversity within the context of our education system. Now, in order to deal with this debate, we joined here in Johannesburg by Professor Phalandwa Mulaudzi, who's the head of African Renaissance Institute at eNCA, Simphiwe, musician and social activist. In our Cape Town studio, we're joined by Dr. Tessa Dowling from the University of Cape Town School of Languages and Literature. Before I begin, I want to just read one of the quotes from Professor Jansen's speech, in which he effectively said the following: "Instruct every teacher and every child in English from the first day of school, rather than add the burden of poor instruction in the mother tongue in the foundation years to the trauma of transition to English later on." Professor, can I start with you? How do you respond to that?
I would say that what he said is rather incalculated. Because calculated.
Okay.
Because for a child to be well educated, he or should be educated in his or her mother tongue, because at home, that's where the first education starts. The second layer is when the child is taken to school. So if a child is introduced at early stage to English, whereas at home you find that the primary language being used at home is mother tongue, then it's a drawback. And you can check in various countries where this has been tried to...
Right. Your response?
I agree with the professor. A child, I think it should be a basic right that they are taught in their mother tongue. And the studies are out there. You go online, you just search for mother tongue education, and most experts, linguists, they basically state that a child should be educated in their mother tongue for at least the first 8 years of their life.
Let me put something to you, and I'll ask Professor as well as Dr. Dowling. Professor Jansen says this: there's another reason why English is the language of choice in school. It's that the indigenous languages are so poorly taught. This is where a major miscalculation occurs on the part of language activists. Simply learning in your mother tongue is absolutely no guarantee of improved learning gains in schools, as the disastrous annual national assessment results show year after year. The problem is not the language of instruction, it's the quality of teaching, the knowledge of the curriculum, the stability of the school.
I would actually imagine that the major reason why our children are failing so miserably at schools is the issue of mother tongue education, you know. Because firstly, it has just been introduced now that a child must be taught in their mother tongue the first 3 years, you know, and even then it's dependent on whether the parents agree to that or not.
Are you therefore saying he's wrong when he says, one, the level of instruction of indigenous language is extremely poor, and that in fact the far better way in which children are going to do well is if you worry about teaching qualities, knowledge of curriculum, stability of the school?
Well, he is right.
Are you denying that?
No. He's right about the issue of the language development, right? And I don't think that, though, should stop us from actually starting on that, on developing the languages. You know,
and what do we do in the middle? We do in the interim. What do we do at the moment?
Well, I guess we do what we are doing now, because at least for the first 3 years of a child's life, they are taught in their mother tongue in most instances.
Dr. Dowling, how do you respond to Professor Jansen's call?
You know, I can see where he's coming from in a qualified way, because we have many different schools in South Africa, and some of them have many different languages in one classroom. So how are you going to teach the mother tongue when there are 9 different mother tongues in that classroom? You have to use English as a lingua franca. But in a little village like Nembu, where the only language is Xhosa that the child is going to grow up with here in their linguistic landscape, here on the radio, then obviously they must be taught in the mother tongue. But I agree that the mother tongue curricula is outdated. Even the standard versions of the language are outdated. We need to revise, revamp those curricula, and even the idea and the notion of a standard Xhosa, for example, needs to be revisited, and we need academics to do that research. But nobody is coming into the university saying, I want to study African languages. So we have this catch-22 situation, is we need academics, but we don't get there.
You see, what I asked Ms. Dana as well, which is what I want to ask you, is then how do you start this process if you've got a situation whereby, to some considerable extent, there's massive inadequacy about teaching the stuff properly in indigenous languages? Are you therefore going to start now and penalize a generation of children?
I think we need to start with the mother tongue in those areas where the mother tongue is predominant, when there is one mother tongue.
Right.
And I think those teachers need to be trained how to teach the mother tongue, because purely speaking a language doesn't mean you understand the pedagogy of that language and how to use that language in educational instruction, because you yourself might have been taught in English. So you've got a clash of concepts, a clash of ideas. So we need to take this training on board, and we need to train our teachers. If we suddenly say to everybody, teach in English, our teachers in those little villages can't speak English. So I do understand where Professor Jansen is saying in urban areas where the teachers understand English, where there's lots of access to English, then sure, let's use English, and where there are multilingual classrooms. But in the other classrooms, we need to re-look at African languages themselves and how they are taught and how those teachers teach them and how they teach maths and science using those languages.
Right.
And often we find huge conceptual gaps.
Well, thank you very much. I do want to come back to you. I've got to take a break, and then I want to perhaps ask my guest in Johannesburg to respond to some of the matters that you've spoken of. Welcome back. Professor, can I ask you to respond to the first point that Ms. Dowling has made, that Professor Jansen may have a point if you've got schools where there are a multiplicity of different indigenous languages?
What my colleague Tessa said, he's supporting a bit what Professor Jansen said, because Professor Jansen, he's trying to address what we are seeing right now.
Yes.
He's not addressing the root of the problem, because the root of the problem, it is when we Africans were started to be colonized. When we are colonized and when we are introduced to education, the only way to do that was to use English and later on and Afrikaans. That's the reason why you find that the Afrikaans children, they perform very well, because from grade R up to doctoral level, they use Afrikaans. And in our case, it's a struggle. You stand that at home, then I'm going to use my Tshivenda or Sepedi or Setswana, and when the child goes to school, he or she introduced to English or Afrikaans. I would rather say that for the time being, we can do that, but we mustn't bank on that one.
I accept that, but I'm sorry to probe you on this. What about the context where you've got schools where you have a multiplicity of languages? What do you do then? I'm going to come to the second point, but when you've got a school, as Dr. Dowling says, where there may be many languages, do you have a common language then that you teach children? And would that be English?
I would say in that context, whereby you find that you have got the speakers, children, what the speakers of 9 indigenous
What
language,
do you do?
Maybe you can use the English, but those children must be introduced to their mother tongue.
How would you do that if you've got, say, 30 children speaking 9 different languages?
Oh, only 30.
I'm just saying in a class. How would you do that?
Oh, you can teach them in English, but at the same time, you can use one of the indigenous language as a second language for them,
okay,
just to introduce them to the cultural aspects and so on.
But do you also accept that? I mean, what do you do when you've got, in a country where you have a multiplicity of languages, and it's arguable that children may come from different communities speaking different languages?
Well,
how do you weld them together so that they?
Yeah. Well, it's quite problematic, you know. But you find that those children who will be in one class and they all speak different languages, that most times they're from the same community, chances are, you know, and there is a cross-pollination of the languages, you know, amongst them, you know. So when the one is speaking Sesotho and the other one answers in Zulu, you know, they understand each other.
But would you, so how would which language do you choose to teach them?
So now, the teacher, whether they're teaching in English or not, they can still communicate with the children in the different languages.
I accept that, but how would you teach them? In what would be the materials? What language would be the basis?
No. The basis would be English, you know, because also chances are those children, you know, for instance, Johannesburg, you know, the kids here grow up with English. They know it, not as well, you know, as first English speakers, but they grow in a community where it's largely spoken. Unlike if you go to a rural village in Butterworth, for instance. So there would be that, but the teacher, it would still be the duty of the teacher to make sure that if one child doesn't understand, she can then try and explain to that child in their own language.
Can I ask you this? It's often suggested that, well, if you do this, when you get to subjects like maths and science, if you don't teach it in English, you're going to get into big trouble if you revert to the indigenous languages. How do you respond to that? I mean, you must have heard that.
Yes, I would say right now, on the surface, yes, it can be a problem. But we, right now, in various institutions, including UNISA, UCT, and so forth, we are starting a system whereby we are developing the terminology for each and every area of study. And that's the starting point, whereby later on we'll move to the next stage in order to introduce this in sort of a way of teaching mathematics and so forth. University of KwaZulu-Natal, they are experimenting in teaching physics, and then this here I will have to maybe to be corrected. It's a mathematics and physics in isiZulu. That's the pilot project, whereby we can see whether the terminology we are using is the correct one, which can be the answer.
Dr. Dowling, can I just probe you on this as well? Bearing in mind the fact that South Africa is often criticized for having appalling maths and science results that were way beyond other countries in Africa, when you look at all the research. To move to teaching science and maths and indigenous languages, isn't that going to just add to the problem?
It could add to the problem, but I have a former student who is a maths teacher who is now working in the townships, and she said that the fact that she's learned Xhosa with me has enabled her to become a better maths teacher. So she uses a scaffolding approach in which she teaches the maths using English, then explains the difficult concepts in a Xhosa discourse, then again back in English, and that has greatly helped her teaching. So I think our teachers need to become more multilingual. Our English-speaking teachers need to move with their knowledge, their skills base, need to move into townships. But there's so many other problems, and that is that what this student of mine was saying is that the knowledge, the actual knowledge of the maths is not there with many of the teachers. The language, he said, is secondary. Once you have the knowledge and you have the textbooks, you have the resources, then language can help you. But you said if you don't have the language in the first place, I think we do have to look at our teacher training.
So Jansen's right that we've got that the real problems at the moment are less about the language and more about the competence, more about the stability, more about the curriculum, and all the other issues that we've spoken about in this program, many others, over a very long time.
Yeah.
Then can I just ask one question? Well, how come then in Zimbabwe, where those of us who teach at universities are confronted on a daily basis by students who perform in the most outstanding fashion, even to this very day, they've used English as the language? And look at their results.
And that's a consistent policy because they introduced English as the medium of instruction, and that they have been consistent. The problem with the South African language policy in education is that it's not consistent. So what happens in the classroom and what happens policy-wise, and what happens in the textbooks, and what happens in the actual examinations. And I've seen the national assessment examinations in which children don't know how to write the mother tongue for 5,624 because they only know the English. So clearly in the classroom they've been taught in English but examined in the mother tongue.
Okay,
so I think what happens in Zimbabwe is that it's consistent.
All right, we'll get back to that too, but I must take another break. Welcome back. In his speech, Professor Jansen also makes another point, which I'd like to show you by way of a graphic. He says, you simply cannot prepare young people for dealing with the scars of our violent past without creating optimal opportunities in the educational environment for living and learning together. He continues, I also believe that there's no way in which young people across divisions can heal past rifts without a common language, that is English. What do you say about that? That the use of language allows us to develop a sense of unity in the country. You need a common language for that. And unfortunately, the only one, whether you like it or not, is English. That's his argument.
Well, I think there were studies that were done, you know, where it was said, actually, as much as we want to believe that language, English is widely spoken, it actually is spoken by very few people.
Yes,
it's just that
it's the second language for everybody, or third language for everybody.
It's forced on everyone, but it's not the most widespread language in South Africa.
It may not be, but it's the one that everybody uses as a second language. And the question that I think he's putting, which is what I want to put to you, is he's saying, in a country which the past, with all the divisions that we've had, trying to actually get young people to move across those divisions, it's very useful, maybe imperative, to have a common language. And that ultimately is the one that people may speak as their second, but it's there, and that's English.
Funnily enough, the most widely spoken language in South Africa is Zulu.
Yes, but not by everybody as their second language. If you
but
want,
my point is, it's because it's forced upon everyone. So if, for instance, we changed it and we had Zulu as a language that is forced on everyone, then people would speak
Yes, but
Zulu.
you're starting already from a position, I think he's suggesting, that at this moment it's easier if you accept the reality and teach English as the unifying
But our children
feature.
are failing because of the English.
Well, no, we established that the children are failing because of the incompetence of the education system.
Oh, okay. I went on a research mission.
Yes.
I visited about 18 schools.
Yes.
In the country, and because I was trying to understand why things
Children
are so bad, right? And from what I figured out, that despite the infrastructural issues and the textbooks not being there, all of that, because I mean we also grew up like that, where we hardly had any, you know, infrastructure or this or that. The one main issue is that children do not understand the language that they're being instructed in. The teachers themselves do not speak the language properly. That's what came out strongest.
No, I think that's exactly what Dr. Dowling is also saying, which means that that's a particular problem. But I'm particularly interested in whether maybe it has to be a different language other than English. I accept that. The question which I suppose I'm probing, Dr. Dowling, if I can ask you as well, is whether at least this, that Jansen is right for saying you've got to have some common language to heal the divisions of the past. It may not be English. It may be, as Simphiwe says, another language. Maybe Xhosa, I don't know. But I mean, one language.
I think that we always have a bipolarity, and I think we need to come to understand that we have this linguistic diversity, and we all need to take part in it. So English-speaking South Africans also need to come to the table and learn Zulu, for example. If we acknowledge that Zulu is a massive language in South Africa, and it will hugely aid our teachers to be able to speak it and understand it, then let us learn Zulu. Let us teach people how to speak Zulu. But that requires amazing resources, a lot of funding, a lot of training. So I understand where he's coming from, because all the other options are so expensive and require so much time.
So let me put you on the spot.
And we don't have the political will.
So let me put you on the spot. If you were the Minister of Education now, one, would you accept the need to have a common language which people can speak across divides? And two, what would it be?
I would
You can deny the first one if you want to, but I'm just interested. Do you accept that there should be one language, that at least we can all communicate with each other?
I would love that to be so, that there would be one language that we could all communicate with each other. And I would love that language to be Zulu, actually.
But is that practical?
What I think it is it practical?
Yeah. Now, in the year 2013, I'm going to give you a chance now, Professor. I know you want to talk. Yeah. All right.
What is practical is English in urban areas and the mother tongue in rural areas, with a additive bilingualism in which English is taught superbly by English teachers who understand the need and how to teach second language speakers how to speak English and how to write English. And I think if we had those two things happening, and students should be incentivized to work in rural areas, to teach English in those areas, we should have English speakers teaching English in rural areas.
Professor,
that is what I would like to incentivize as Minister of Education.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to put you on the same spot, Professor. How would you respond? And let me make it perfectly clear. Coming from my position, I certainly think it would be critical for people who are English speakers to be able to speak, say, Zulu. I mean, I resent the fact that my education system coming out of the apartheid from my generation never did that to me. But I'm looking at the situation in 2013. What can we do to optimize the lives of our children within this context? What would you do?
I think Tessa said something about multilingualism. I think that I would like to promote, not to downplay one language against another.
Right.
Although I would quite agree that Zulu is predominantly spoken in the country. But for us, maybe to say that English unify the whole country, let's say we are...
He's talking about one language, and he's suggesting it should be English because that's the most practical way to go.
Yeah, but right now, if you look at the 50 million South Africans here, you'll find that the majority of those whom we say that can speak English, they're in the urban areas. And when you go to rural areas, if you go to Butterworth or you go to Toyando or wherever, you start speaking English, they will not even understand what you're saying.
So how do we deal with the problem then? Do we have a common language, or do we just accept that we've got to have a multilingual approach? What is the approach we then adopt?
I understand what you are trying to probe, that maybe for us to try to communicate with one another, we need to have a common language. But I think that debate should be also taken by the South African, not the way it was done. Because in the past, you see, Afrikaans and
No. In fact, in fairness to him, that's the majority of his speech. It's about the Afrikaans-English problem. But he obviously has raised others. Let me ask you this then. How do you then respond to the question that in Zimbabwe they've used English and their educational results have been nothing short of phenomenal compared to ours?
As Tessa said, you see, there was inconsistency in their policy, and that was well introduced way back, unlike here, whereby you find that there was some controversy. You see, Afrikaans was introduced, English and the mother tongue, and then we went back to Afrikaans and English.
Are you saying the issue in Zimbabwe is less about the fact that it was English and more about the fact that it was a consistent policy?
Yes. Should I also put this on the table?
Sure.
Because when you look at the Afrikaans community, always throughout they've been using Afrikaans from grade R up to doctoral level. You go to Japan, the similar process. You go to Russia, the similar process. And those people, they are well developed. They cannot even speak English. And then when I was in Japan, I was surprised that how well developed they are.
Notwithstanding the fact that most of them don't speak English. That's the point you're making. Okay. I'm afraid I have to end this debate, although I'm ending the program rather than the debate. This is a really very important issue. We've already dealt with two questions here. The one is whether, in fact, we need to utilize English because of the inadequacies of our educational system at present. That is, because there's been such poor instruction in mother tongue. And you've heard a lot of the debate about that maybe that's so, but that's a support issue, that's an issue we have to deal with in the short term. There is the broader question. Should we have one language in which all people can communicate? If so, what should that be? And how should we deal with that? Or alternatively, is it not possible that we can have multilingual discourses straddling divides? And finally, the point put up is, does it have to be English? After all, there are many countries which are really in the first world in the global race, and yet, as the professor suggested, many of them don't speak English. So how do we deal with these really pressing questions? To Professor Jansen, I suspect we should be indebted for raising the debate. How you come out in this debate, judge for yourself. Goodbye.